Good afternoon, sisters. My name is Fran Fasolka, and I'm an IHM sister from Scranton, Pennsylvania. I am pleased to introduce to you today our speaker and presenter, Susan Terrell. I first met Susan at Marywood University here in Scranton, where she served as provost. It was at Marywood that Susan met the IHM sisters. We IHMs are delighted that Susan is an IHM associate. Susan holds a PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Houston. She has served in higher education for more than 30 years and brings a passion to her work for supporting people and designing and implementing effective processes. She served in leadership as department chair, associate provost, dean, and provost. She brings those experiences, as well as her training and practice as a psychologist, to synthesize best practices and approaches in a new paradigm about what it means to be an effective leader in the 21st century. A seasoned administrator who is a teacher at heart, Susan welcomes the opportunity to share her learnings with new and aspiring leaders to strengthen their leadership skills, encourage their optimism, and support their vision for new possibilities. In clinical practice since 1987, Susan has spent many years advocating for equity, diversity, and inclusion as a licensed psychologist, researcher, academic, author, and administrator. Her areas of expertise include LGBTQ+ healthcare concerns and intimate partner relationships. In 2014, Susan joined the practitioners at the Bassett Healthcare Network Gender Wellness Center in Oneida, New York, to provide psychotherapy and assessments for transgender patients, their partners, and their families. In addition to her clinical practice, Susan serves on the faculty at Marywood University. Susan and her wife, Sandy, reside in Scranton. Thank you, Susan, for being with us today to help us open our hearts and our minds to the magnificent beauty and diversity of our LGBTQ+ community. Welcome.
So I've been asked to cover a really broad and deep area of inquiry. And I also know that with 100 or not almost 100 people here, that you bring a range of engagement with these topics. From some of you, it's probably preliminary exploration, and others bring a deep understanding. And some of it's going to be from didactic study, and some is going to be lived experience. So regardless of where you sit, this time together collectively is designed to explore how to create a more gender inclusive religious community and life. And thanks for joining all of us on this part of that journey. Ellen Kasich wrote, "In the beginning is the question, is it a boy or a girl?" The answer itself is destiny. Is destiny itself, and in one word establishes hundreds, thousands of future life experiences. Everything from manner of dress, posture, appropriate seating positions, eating patterns, to freedom of movement in public, performance of household chores, sexual expression, voice tone and inflection, safety, educational paths, career choices, self-esteem, and self-concept. All of this flows from the gender one is assigned at birth as a function of anatomy. So sex and gender are the focus of today, and they're just some of the identities that shape us. It's important to remember that identities are fluid. Some of them can change over time. And they are contextual, that is, some are more salient at times than others. They're also intersectional. They intersect in ways that create each of us uniquely. So let's start by exploring a bit more about the identities of who are here today. So we're going to spend maybe 5 seconds on each of these. These are anonymous polls, so feel free to participate or not, but they will only be provided in the information will be provided in the aggregate. And it's just to get a sense of who's here today. And Grace is going to help us with these anonymous polls. So when we talk about identities, and some of the other ones we would have done would have been around socioeconomic status of our families of origin, our ethnicity or race, whether or not we live with a chronic illness or disability, our gender identity, and our sexual orientation. And those are just a handful of identities. We will be talking more about many of them. But as you heard me talk about sort of that brief list just now, I want us to just notice that some identities are more embodied than others. That is, we think we can tell from the body what someone's identity might be about something, but that's not always the case. For example, you can see, you might be looking at my body on this little square, this little Zoom square, that I appear to be a white woman, and you'd be correct in that case. What you can't see that's not embodied is that I also am Jewish and I also am a lesbian. So we can have identities that are more or less visible and some that are hidden unless we choose to disclose. And how visible they are, how embodied the identities are, impact us and our relation to ourselves in the world. So we'll come back to that idea, but please keep in mind this idea of embodiment. I think it's important. All right. So hopefully this technology is working and you can see a wheel of power and privilege. People can see it? And okay. And if there are ways to move, well, hopefully you can make it bigger or smaller on your screen as you need to. So what I'd like to do is have us start to look at various identities. And these are, I'm going to be speaking from a Western United States point of view. That's my location, that's my worldview. So I recognize this may not be universal globally, but I think some of it may be. And we're going to look at, these are all different, each of these wedges deals with a different identity. So let's just notice that some of these identities have to do with skin color, which deals with ethnicity or race, body size, our sexuality, our education, gender, language. You can read around the outside of the circle some identities. This is not all inclusive. The closer we are to the center of the diagram on any one of these identities means that we have more power and privilege in the world. And the further out on each of these wedges where we locate ourselves on each of these identities, we're likely to be marginalized or experience oppression. For example, groups with power, that inner circle, which is sometimes called privilege, might be cisgender men who are white, heterosexual, rich, able-bodied, slim, and educated. Note that religion isn't on this particular wheel. I actually picked it because it was colorful and I liked some of the other categories. But notice that in the US, we would probably place Protestant Christian in the middle, closest to power. And then maybe Catholicism would be a bit further out. And being Jewish or Muslim would be closer to the outside in terms of where it would fall on each wedge. Sometimes wheels like this include isms, that is racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, etc., to make sure that we notice that there are systematic influences that keep these hierarchies of power in place. So you might think about that skin color one up at the top as racism being the ism that begins to set up these hierarchies, white people having more power, darker people having less power or being marginalized. So let's focus on the center identities first, the ones with power. if you all would, each of you, take a moment to yourselves, identify a wedge or two in which you are close to the center ring. So those of us that identify as white, that might be an obvious one. If you're good mental health, it might be robust mental health. Pick one or two that call to you. And notice that if you are part of that identity group, you have privilege, you have power. This concept of privilege is sometimes misunderstood. Privilege, the word privilege, is unearned. It's an accident of birth, either biologically or socially. And just by the very nature of being born into this identity or coming to be part of that identity, we're closer to the center of the wheel. I've often thought of privilege. There's a metaphor that I really like about privilege, the unearned part of it in particular, that I think helps us understand what it means. I don't know about you all, but to stay relatively healthy during this time of COVID, I try to get outside quite a bit, and my wife and I go for walks by the river. When we're on a walk and there's a wind to our back, we're having an easy day of it. We're just walking. We're having a great journey, enjoying nature. But when we turn around, we go out the mile, we come back. And when we come back, if there's a breeze blowing, sometimes a stronger wind, sometimes a light breeze, we have a little bit of a more difficult journey as we're walking back. Privilege is like that wind to our back. It's unearned, it's there, we don't notice it because our journey is being made easier by having it. And people who don't have privilege on any one of these identities, oftentimes their journey, they're facing a breeze, or sometimes it's a hurricane gale wind, depending on the situation. An example would be, I mentioned to you earlier that I'm Jewish. So, those of you, I assume everyone else may be on this call, I don't know for sure, but those of you, identify as Catholic and Christian, you automatically might get time off from your work in order to celebrate important holidays. For me, it's not like I can't take time off to celebrate Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, but I have to take extra steps in order to make that happen in my life. That's the breeze that I face. So hopefully that makes some sense about how privilege might influence people who are closer to the center of the circle. Areas in which we have privilege do not make us bad people. It's not a wrong way to be. We're not trying to create a new hierarchy of these identities. It's the hierarchy of the identities of which that some identities and some people are valued more. That's what's wrong. That's what's hurtful. We shouldn't feel guilty about having privilege. In fact, guilt can help keep us from exploring and acknowledging the impact of this hierarchy of power on ourselves and on others. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impact of this hierarchy. And again, think about some area in which you are closer to the center. So embedded in these power dynamics for all of these identities, the closer we are to the center of the circle, these are the ways in which Western world that is considered more of value, the ways of being in the world that are considered more valued than others. And some of the benefits of this privilege being in the center of the circle, wherever we fall in the center, our reality is seen as the only option to be in the world, and everybody else may be invisible, and it defines reality for all of humankind. Or if other identities really are acknowledged, there's the center circle is still seen as the right or better way to be. The closer we are to the center, we also don't have to know much about other groups' realities. So I happen to have legs that work well. I'm ambulatory. When I lived in, I had a very close friend who was a quadriplegic, and typically when I would join her and her husband for dinner, they both used wheelchairs. I would go to their home. But one time we decided to go out to eat, and I suggested a restaurant, and Kathleen said to me, "Is there a ramp?" I didn't have a clue. I didn't have to know I didn't have to calculate whether a restaurant had a ramp or not. I could just think about what kind of food I wanted to eat and whether it was good food or not. So I didn't have to know much about her reality, but she obviously had to pay careful attention in that way. The closer we are to the center of the wheel, there's no significant consequences if we don't know about the other group's realities. So was there a real consequence to me about whether that restaurant had a ramp? No, not unless I wanted to join them for dinner there. The closer we are to the center, we're never asked to speak for the whole group. So it would be unusual for me to be asked to speak for all white people. And my response would be, how could I do that? We know that there's much more heterogeneity in any group than there is homogeneity. So we're not asked to speak for the whole group. And cultural institutions support this worldview. Institutions such as language, religion, politics, education, media. I mean, we could spend hours on each of these and how they support the valuing of that inner circle over other folks. I'm just going to use a few examples of gender. So in language, the use of the word he is considered generic. It includes everybody, even though we know it excludes everybody who does not identify as male. In education as a system, we still think of the canon. The people we need to study are dead old white men. In media, think about the sexualization of women to sell products. Politics, we just celebrated 100 years of voting in this country for women, and yet we're not even, given this last election, 24% of the Senate is only 27% of the US House of Representatives. When you get to the states, it gets a little better, hovers around 30%. Only 22% of mayors in cities over 30,000 are women. And how many women have been presidents yet? And then religion. This is something I'm sure you all have spent time talking about in other circles, but certainly the imagery that's pervasive that God is male is certainly an example of how an institution backs up the hierarchy around gender. So remember, as we're talking about, please keep in mind that even if we're in that inner circle in any one identity, our privilege is unearned. It does not make us bad people. It just means that we live in a world that our reality is backed and supported by societal institutions. Now, I'm going to ask each of you to find an identity ring in which you may be closer to the outer ring, an identity wedge, or in the outer ring or closer to the outer ring. And think about this identity as we explore some of the effects to be part of one of those outer rings. These are the effects of being marginalized or oppressed. Oftentimes, if we fall in one of those identities, that's where stereotypes come in. People who are in those identities are seen as two-dimensional. For example, the stereotype that all poor people are viewed as lazy. The realities of people's lives are discounted. So media images, in terms of selling things, might only reflect pretty and slim and young people, unless they're selling Depends or some sort of medication these days. But it reflects only a section of folks. Movies are designed for teenage audiences, oftentimes teenage boys. If we're one of the outer circle, sometimes tokenism is used to pretend that some group is being inclusive. Even affirmative action, people that we think of affirmative action as being something that will help around race and sex. But people may be included, but only in limited numbers. Sometimes people are like, one is enough or two is enough. And voices may not really be included. Oftentimes people will have to assimilate to the dominant identity in order to be accepted. Unfortunately, we sometimes often will internalize negative messages about being less than. In planning this conference, I was aware in listening to some of the discussions of the planning committee that even the fact that there's a New Ways ministry lets us know that there are still concerns within the Catholic Church about people being identified, people identifying themselves as something other than cisgender or heterosexual. If we're part of one of the outer circles, we actually can suffer consequences if we don't know or understand the realities of the privileged group. As a college, being somebody affiliated with academia for most of my career, I'm aware that first generation college students, for example, so their parents might have grown up poor, even though they themselves might come from a family that has some money. But they're often, the first generation students often are at a loss compared to their counterparts who come from educated families because their parents don't know how to help them with college. So they have a harder time navigating. They feel like they don't fit in. They feel like they're imposters. And so that would be an example of suffering consequences because they don't know the privileged group, what it means to be rich or come from a family that already comes with educated parents. Now, it's not all negative. Those of us on the outer circle on any identity can walk in multiple worlds. We know privileged groups' realities really well. So, for example, I'm very much aware of Christian holidays, but you all may not be as aware of the important premises that underlie Judaism. One final thought about this wheel of power and privilege and identities is notice that these identities intersect. So, for example, white cisgender men, that is men whose gender conforms to, matches their body. We'll come back to that concept in a little bit. Who are poor experience the world differently than white cisgender men who are rich. And we can look at any of these to notice how this intersectionality, we could discuss hours talking about the impact of intersectionality, and it's really important. But I'm going to move on because today's focus is on sex and gender. All right. So this is called a genderbread person. I've actually chosen a simplified version. If any of you are interested after the time together today, there is a whole website on this and they keep adding more and more layers to it. But I just want to ground ourselves a little bit in the various aspects of sex and gender. And I think one of the most important things to take away from today is that none of these are a dichotomy. None of these are a binary. None of these are either or. And yet, as a culture, we persist in this illusion. So I'd like to start with biological sex. Now, biological sex refers to biology. It refers to physiology, whether it's anatomy or genes or chromosomes. And note that even sex is not a binary. So there are, I think maybe 3% of the population in the US are born intersexed, a mix of both male and female biology. So even that is not a binary. So when we talk about sex, typically we're talking about biological aspects of who we are. Gender is both how we express ourselves and how we think about being masculine, feminine, both or neither. And also there's our gender expression, and there's also our internal sense of self, our gender identity. So expression is how we look or present. And in Western culture specifically, although there's some of these that apply more globally, we persist in this idea of opposite sex. If you think about the term opposite, it implies a binary. It implies either or, we're one or the other. And this results in stereotypes. So there was a study done many years ago, it's been replicated a number of times, where they gave citizens of 25 different Western countries, which traits are masculine and which are feminine, which go with being a man, which go with being a woman. And there actually was consensus on, there were many traits they provided, but on 74 of them, there was consensus. Of these, so of the 25 nations, there were 49 traits that were associated with being men across these countries. And those, I'm just going to name a sample of them. Active, independent, strong, adventurous, aggressive, hard-headed, robust, energetic, wise. Now, for all these countries, this was attributed with being male. And I'm guessing there are many of you today, as you listen to those, that you're thinking, that describes me. And you may not identify as male. There also were traits that were associated with being female. Again, consensus: affectionate, attractive, dreamy, fearful, sensitive, sentimental, submissive, superstitious, and weak. And I would guess that there are many of you out there who identify as female that you're saying these don't fit me at all. And you may also hear some value-laden traits here, that we tend to value the ones associated with maleness on the whole more than being with femaleness. So this, these may or may not apply to you, but this is an example of how pervasive the stereotypes are about maleness and femaleness, and the idea that these are somehow polar opposites, that these are opposite traits. So, so that's about gender and gender expression. We're going to come back to gender identity in just a little bit. Sexual orientation is another aspect of people, and this is who one might be attracted to. Are we attracted to someone that is of the assumed same sex? The other assumed sex? Are we attracted to all people? No one? And are we attracted to folks who present in a more masculine way, a more feminine way, or a way that is more androgynous, a mixture of both what we consider to be maleness and femaleness? And the labels that go with this might be heterosexual or straight, lesbian, which would imply being a woman attracted to other people who present as women. Gay is an umbrella term and can be used for men or women or people who identify in different gender identities, which we'll get to in a minute. Bisexual is attracted to people who present as both men and women. Asexual is not feeling sexual, not being attracted to anybody. Pansexual is attracted to everybody and every gender expression. And what I want you to note as we look at some of this is that heterosexuality is embedded in gender roles. We assume that women are attracted to men and vice versa. And actually, to identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual is to violate gender norms. I want you to also, so let's talk about gender identity for a minute, which I think is the last one on there I haven't spoken with. And gender identity is how one defends their gender, and it may or may not match the body they were born in. So for those of us whose gender or sex assigned at birth matches how we think about ourselves in a gendered way, how we think about it is called cisgender. So my body is female, I think of myself as a woman, I am cisgender. It's important to note that all of these aspects, one's gender identity, one's gender expression, one's sex, one's gender assigned at birth, one's sexual orientation, all of those do not line up in a neat binary. People can find themselves attracted to women who present more masculine or more feminine. They themselves might be in a female body, or they may identify, their gender may be that of not identifying with gender or identifying male. So these don't line up in any kind of binary or linear way. That's why you see little circles with X's, with the line going through it, saying that these don't line up in any particular way, nor are they linear, even though this particular diagram tries to, has to use some linearity, some binary, and even to talk about it. It just shows how limited our language is and how binary our language is around all this. So I want to spend a little bit of time, let me one thing, share the next thing. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about folks for whom gender identity challenges the binary. And these are folks who identify as transgender. And I want to just go over these terms with you just a little bit, but I also want you to note that even within people for whom their body and their gender identity aren't congruent for them, that even within this community and the transgender overall umbrella, there still is a binary that creates some difficulties for some folks. So there's still a pull toward binary around gender, even within transgender. This is how embedded this binary is in our thinking around gender. So notice that under the transgender umbrella, transgender just means that one's body and how one thinks about oneself in gender is not cisgender. It's not exactly congruent for them. There are some folks who still fall under a fairly binary umbrella within transgender. So someone who may be assigned female at birth, but identifies as a man might call themselves a trans man. And those who are assigned male at birth, whose gender identity is female, might see themselves as a trans woman. There are lots of folks whose gender identity doesn't neatly fall within a binary, and that's the non-binary umbrella. And there are some words there that are used where people talk about being a demi-boy, sometimes spelled B-O-I, just trying to get away from gendered language, demi-girl, gender fluid, bigender, gender queer, neutrois, there's agender, there's so many more, not non-binary, gender non-conforming. There's so many, and I want to just let you all know, although I'm sharing with you these terms, I learn new terms almost, I would say, if not weekly, then monthly. So don't get caught up on being concerned about using the wrong term. We'll talk more about how you can be a good ally to people who are under this transgender umbrella. So what makes gender so important? Why does it matter? Whether expressed in gender identity, sexual orientation is a part of that. Why do we talk about opposite sex? Why does this binary persist? Remember that first wheel where I talked about power and privilege, that I shared identities? And I've come to believe that I think it's all about elevation of maleness over femaleness to maintain sexism, to maintain a hierarchy of gender. We have to pretend that we're opposite in order to maintain this illusion of maleness over femaleness, this illusion of difference, of a dichotomy, of an either or. Think about it. Think about men and women, male and female bodies. Let's just start with that. How much more similarity is there than difference? Where's the difference lie? It's in some sex characteristics, right? It's not, we all have eyes, nose, mouth, ears, heads, arms, legs. There's so much more overlap, both biologically and socially. Just those stereotype traits that I mentioned to you earlier, where there's Western global agreement on what's male and female. There's so much more overlap, right? We know sensitive men, we know cruel women. There's so much more overlap than there is difference, and yet this binary persists. So let's think for a minute, whose reality, what identity, what reality does it serve to maintain this hierarchy of maleness over femaleness? Male reality continues to be the norm. It perpetuates that. It perpetuates it as being the only way to be or the better way to be. So think, for example, about the workplace and how it's set up under a male norm. It's supposed to work long hours to be successful. Certainly, good workers are not considered someone who takes care of kids or elderly family. Success equals more money. Think about the workplace where in most workplaces, you're not supposed to show emotion, definitely reflecting a more of a male masculine reality in the workplace. This hierarchy of elevating maleness over femaleness ultimately harms everyone, but disproportionately it harms people who present or identify as women. It creates a double bind for people who present as women. If women emulate masculinity, if they're assertive, for example, what are they called compared to assertive men? So there's a double bind created. There's a double bind created. And we also devalue men, people present as male, who present as more feminine. So the topic, and again, we could spend hours talking about that. But the topic of this gathering mentioned both sexual orientation and gender. So let's connect that. If sexism is the valuing of maleness over femaleness, heterosexism is also part of this, as I mentioned before. That is, sexual orientation is part of gender role stereotypes. So we assume that people who present as men are supposed to be attracted to women, and people who present as women are supposed to be attracted to men. And we don't know, and heterosexism just doesn't even mention or doesn't know what to do with folks who are non-binary or gender nonconforming. And cisgenderism keeps biological maleness, heterosexuality, and cisgender people as the norm, as the better way to be. And all of this, I believe, is in service of keeping maleness above femaleness, perpetuating this dichotomy. Suzanne Farr, her last name is spelled P-H-A-R-R, helped us to see homophobia as a weapon of sexism, and how any person who presents as a woman who does not conform may be considered a lesbian. So even if a woman who violates traditional feminine gender role stereotypes does not conform, she's often considered a lesbian, and that's seen as a bad thing, right? No longer would have heterosexual privilege, even if she happens to be heterosexual. Transgender people, particularly transgender women of color, are murdered for not conforming to their sex assigned at birth and presenting as female to boot, which is the lesser way to be. All of this, sexism, heterosexism, cisgenderism, is rooted in a binary around a sex gender system and the valuing of maleness and devaluing of femaleness. And it's not easy to challenge this sex gender system. This hierarchy of power and privilege is kept in place by isolating groups from one another. The groups in the outer circle are kept from joining together. Economic controls, people can be punished economically, lose their jobs if they don't conform. Intimidation, think about, I'm switching from sex and gender here, but I think about the rise in swastikas being painted, the clinic bombings for abortion, but the bombing of the synagogue in Pittsburgh a couple years ago. So there's intimidation and there's actual violence and abuse. Think about, what is it, a third of women in heterosexual, well, all relationships, whether it's same sex or different sex, but a great number of women in heterosexual, I think it's a third in heterosexual relationships, are abused. This system of power and privilege and domination and keeping that marginalization in place is kept in place by systems that ultimately are backed up by the threat of or actual violence. So it's very hard to challenge these systems. It's very hard to challenge and be visible. I believe the sex gender system is not good for anyone. If you're feminized in any way or don't conform to a binary, regardless of one's sex and gender, you can be victims of control and violence. You could live in poverty due to discrimination around work, isolation, low self-esteem from internalizing those messages, and being depressed from not having power, feeling empowered. If we're masculinized, if the body is masculinized or one presents in a more masculine way, those folks have restricted emotionality. They don't get to be full human beings. They have restricted affectional and sexual behavior. There can be an obsession with achievement and money. There's physical effects in terms of increased risk for serious medical conditions. And rejecting everything feminine means being less than fully human being. Yet Western cultures continue to push for such a binary, a dichotomy between masculine and feminine, male and female, and it ignores all variations and overlap. So what's the harm if people are more alike than different in gender characteristics? It's to maintain this binary. As I've come to believe, it's to keep these power dynamics, the hierarchy of maleness over femaleness, intact, regardless of the body. So I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about transgender identities, what we saw in that umbrella slide. Because I think as a community, we can learn from people who identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary. People who don't identify with the sex gender assigned at birth can really help all of us challenge this binary. And due to the institutional controls that reinforce the binary, that is, their realities are not acknowledged, they face intimidation, they face violence, those of us who identify as cisgender need to really challenge those institutional controls and be allies. Transgender people tell us that they need us, cisgender people, to be allies. They need to be addressed by their personal and identified name and pronouns. Notice I didn't use the word preferred, because just like with cisgender people, it's our personal pronouns or our personal name that reflects who we are. It's not our preference, it's who we are. They need forms and documents that are inclusive of their identity. That is, they need birth certificates to be able to be changed and driver's licenses that gives their correct and their own gender identity. They need organizations to have policies that include specific transgender discrimination protection. They need to be able to access bathrooms that align with their gender identity or have gender inclusive bathrooms. They need people to understand the complexities of gender and embrace expressions of gender outside the binary. So to be allies, we need to be open, willing to listen and learn, and to foster safe and discrimination-free environments for transgender and gender nonconforming people. If we're transgender, we should not tolerate disrespect. We should respond to people who say transphobic things. We should strive to use non-gendered and gendered inclusive language and elevate transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary voices. Our assumptions can get us into trouble. So, those of us who are cisgender or those of us that are heterosexual can't truly know the lived experience of people who are transgender, gender nonconforming, or lesbian, gay, or bisexual. It's not necessary to completely, or even possible to completely understand the lived experience, but it is essential to be affirming, respectful, and offer safe space. Across all identities, but most specifically sexual orientation and gender identity. I often think about Audre Lorde, who wrote in her essay, Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Defining Difference. She wrote, "It is not our differences which separate us, but our reluctance to recognize those differences and to deal effectively with the distortions which have resulted from ignoring and misnaming those differences. The future of our Earth may depend upon the ability of all to identify and develop new definitions of power and new patterns of relating across difference." I hope that these ideas I've presented today will assist all of us to examine these patterns of power dynamics about sex and gender and the resulting limiting binary, and develop new ones to relate across difference. Let it be so. They've asked me to leave some time for questions or comments, and I believe that the way it works best in a big Zoom meeting is you put your name into the chat, and I think Grace might be calling on you in that order. I just want to kind of give you a heads up about what will happen after this. At the end of the questions and answers, and I think it's going to be around 2 o'clock, we'll be taking a break, and I'll be putting up some questions, because when we regather, you will be put into groups that are not going to be at random. They're based on your constituency when you enrolled. And so just want to mention to you that after the break, during the break, the questions will be up for you to look at. And when you'll be returned, you'll be put into these for some smaller, intimate discussion around these questions to help you explore some of these ideas further. You won't need to be reporting out anything you don't want to, but you may think about, somebody may take some notes, and we are hoping that you will want to share some of the wisdom that comes out of the small group experiences. So when you are put in the groups, you may want to decide on who's going to be the spokesperson for that group. So at this point, we're open to questions and more discussion. So. I would be glad to put something together that can be shared after, via email. Absolutely. Yeah. One place, if you just want to think more, is the Genderbread website, where it has those images, also goes into more detail about all these concepts, but I'd be glad to put something together for you. That's a great question. I'm thinking first, I mean, look how many people are here, over 90, and what a great way to begin to think about this as a collective community of folks who are just here today. I think one of the things I think of is two things that I think work against it, and then I'll come back to how maybe to deal with those. You're part of an institution that very much perpetuates all formal religion, traditional religion, perpetuates some of the hierarchy, right? Some of these hierarchies I've been talking about. And in particular, Catholicism at times has been I shouldn't say that. I would say the more fundamentalist a religion is, the more restrictive it can be around exploring some of this. So I know my own relationship, being an associate with the IHM and understanding more and getting to know that particular community. I know they're very progressive, and still it's hard because you've got this institution with all of those institutional controls in place to make it very hard to talk about. And the other piece is more of an intra-psychic. It's inside of us that if we are not part of the dominant group, so and again, this would be those outer circle on that imagery of the identity wheel. We've internalized messages that were not okay. I mean, there's a small part of me that even today, when I was introducing myself and said, "Oh, I'm lesbian and I'm Jewish," there's a part of me that's internalized that those are lesser ways of being. And there's this nanosecond of me thinking, "Oh, are they going to think less of me when I disclose?" So I don't think we can underestimate the power of those oppressive messages that we internalize, that somehow we're less than. And so I'd say that in order to invite that, how do we come together, identify for ourselves where's the internal blockages? And I read the Audre Lorde quote at the end, because honestly, I think that's the way forward. That if we can, to be truly known. There's another quote, there's another essay she wrote that talks about how we're so afraid that we crave to be seen, like who we really are, and yet we're really afraid because of that judgment that can be there, because of that valuing of some people over others. And I would say, if you want to be truly seen and want that really close, the true emotional intimacy, that we have to take risks and share who we are. And I think all of you who are here today are certainly open to wanting to hear others' truths and do it in as open-hearted and non-judgmental way as you can. I think we also have to give each other permission to make mistakes. I mean, we're new at this. There is no place on this planet that I know of that doesn't have this hierarchy. So we're creating it as we go. Thanks for your question. I think you're right that this is going to be something that maybe in the smaller groups, you're going to be able to get into some more robust discussion about it. Again, I would, I want to make sure people understand and keep in mind that you can't underestimate how it's been internalized and how much those institutions strive to keep this in place. There is swift and hard consequences when you try to buck the system. So, and try to undo some of that. And so, your voices, if you identify as cisgender, if you identify as heterosexual, your voices can go a long way to help empower those who are really wanting to be authentically themselves, and to try to help modify the institution within your sphere of influence, and again, listen with an open heart when they're telling you, who they are, who we are. I want to just say that, again, you might see bodies, but remember, some of the identities are not embodied. And so at any given point in time, you don't know who you're interacting with. And so the more inclusive we can be around, or the less we make assumptions and the more we just ask and invite that conversation, can be useful too. So there are folks here who are brave enough to say their pronouns are, they look like they might be in a female body. They are saying their pronouns are they, them. So there are folks here who gender identity may not be female. And so just to be aware that possibility exists, in part as a cisgender woman, that's why I use my pronouns, because I want folks who are gender nonconforming to know that I see them, that I understand that the way one presents in their body may not always be how they think of themselves. So that's in part why I use pronouns. I think most people would gender me with my gender identity. I look female, but I want to let people know visibly that I recognize that that's not true of everyone. I'd like to build on something you said, and that is that part of the benefit of being part of a dominant group, the group closer to the power, is that their feelings are taken care of a lot by everyone. We don't want to make them uncomfortable, right? And so that is part of the dynamic that you might need to be aware of and sort of fight against. Think how powerful it would be to have people speak freely within your communities as either being lesbian or queer or gender nonconforming. That how powerful it would be for others in the community to hear that and to have their own realities validated. I will tell you from, again, personal experience, when I was teaching and sexual orientation was the topic, and I always came out in my classes as lesbian. But there, again, I had to purposely focus on the other students in the class who might also be not heterosexual, because I was modeling for them, and I had to not think about what the reaction would be from the people who were in the dominant group, the heterosexual students. So I think we constantly have to balance, who are we speaking to, whose voices are we trying to elevate, and how we have to notice how we do a lot of caretaking for folks with the power, but also we do caretaking to keep ourselves safe. I mean, if they get pissed, there's violence that can be done. So it's keeping aware. That's why the power dynamics part of this is, I think, so crucial to understanding, whether it's about identities around sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, any of them. There's reasons why some of these practices and ways of being in the world are in place. So thanks for bringing that up. We're going back through history. I think there's always been people who don't conform to gender in one way, and it became more restrictive in recent times and is now, maybe branching out a bit. Thank you for bringing up the age thing. When I was thinking, when you all were mentioning that before, is, first of all, I'm 64, so I don't think it's necessarily generational. I think there's young people that don't get it, and I think there's older folks who do. But I will say that for folks whose own gender identity is not cisgender, it is in general, in some ways, for some people, easier for the young people now. And they have proliferated in the way they talk about it. They do find, I think, more peers that are accepting. Gender just isn't as important for some youth. Mm-hmm. They still have difficulties within families, but they have they're able to, if they have supportive families, they're able to get on medications like hormone blockers before puberty that stop some of the body from developing in ways that would be dysphoric for them, really upsetting, like beyond upsetting. Dysphoria is beyond upsetting, but they're able to do that earlier. So they're not going to be faced with as many medical or surgical interventions when they get older, compared to folks who may not start their transition or come to understand their own gender identity until 60s or 70s, or even 20s, 30s, 40s. So it is different now for some people, but certainly there are many youth who still are in families that are not accepting. And some of that is rooted in some of, like, religious institutions, the more fundamentalist ones. Great point. Thanks for bringing that up. Certainly the another way to choose sexuality or not acting on it, right? So being celibate. So I recognize it really is time for a break. And right, it's time for the break. So what I'm going to do is remind you, I'm going to put up the questions. They'll be up there during the break. I'm glad that people are talking. When you come back from break, I think it's a 15-minute break, so please come back on time. You'll be put into groups where you can continue this conversation, and I've got some questions to help frame the conversation as well in your small groups. If you would please think about, you're not going to be required to report back out, but we're really hoping that this sharing will continue. So please think about who might be your spokesperson, and whoever wants to take some notes to help share back some. We'd love to hear your thoughts and your wisdom. So the meeting will continue in 15 minutes. Go take a bathroom break, coffee break, whatever, and I will be putting up questions that you'll come back to in your small groups in 15 minutes. I said, right? Yeah. Okay. So reconvene in 15.